Chapter 2 Armageddon 2419 AD The Forest Gangs. She gave me a brief outline of the very peculiar social and economic system under which her people lived. At least, it seemed very peculiar from my 20th century viewpoint. I learned with amazement that exactly 492 years had passed over my head as I lay unconscious in the mine. Wilma, for that was her name, did not profess to be a historian, and so could only give me a sketchy outline of the wars that had been fought and the manner in which such radical changes had come about. It seemed that another war had followed the First World War, in which nearly all the European nations had banded together to break the financial and industrial power of America. They succeeded in their purpose, though they were beaten, for the war was a terrific one and left America, like themselves, gasping, bleeding, and disorganized, with only the hollow shell of a victory. This opportunity had been seized by the Russian Soviets, who had made a coalition with the Chinese to sweep over all Europe and reduce it to a state of chaos. America, industrially geared to world production, and the world trade collapsed economically, and there ensued a long period of stagnation and desperate attempts at economic reconstruction. But it was impossible to stave off war with the Mongolians, who by now had subjugated the Russians and were aiming at a world empire. In about 2109, it seems, the conflict was finally precipitated. The Mongolians, with overwhelming fleets of great airships and a science that far outstripped that of crippled America, swept in over the Pacific and Atlantic coast and down from Canada, annihilating American aircraft, armies, and cities with their terrific disintegrator rays. These rays were projected from a machine not unlike a searchlight in appearance, the reflector of which, however, was not material substance but a complicated balance of interacting electronic forces. This resulted in a terribly destructive beam. Under its influence, material substance melted into nothingness, i.e., into electronic vibrations. It destroyed all then known substances, from air to the most dense metals and stone. They settled down to the establishment of what became known as the Han Dynasty in America, as a sort of province in their world empire. Those were terrible days for the Americans. They were hunted like wild beasts. Only those survived who finally found refuge in mountains, canyons, and forests. Government was at an end among them. Anarchy prevailed for several generations. Most would have been eager to submit to the Hans, even if it meant slavery. But the Hans did not want them, for they themselves had marvelous machinery and scientific process by which all difficult labor was accomplished. Ultimately, they stopped their active search for and annihilation of the widely scattered groups of now savage Americans, so long as they remained hidden in their forests and did not venture near the great cities the Hans had built. Little attention was paid to them. Then began the building of the new American civilization. Families and individuals gathered together in clans or gangs for mutual protection. For nearly a century, they lived in a nomadic and primitive life, moving from place to place in desperate fear of the casual and occasional Han air raids and the terrible disintegrator ray. As the frequency of these rays decreased, they began to stay permanently in given localities, organizing upon lines which in many respects were similar to those of the military households of the Norman feudal barons, except that instead of gathering together in castles, their defense tactics necessitated a certain scattering of living quarters for families and individuals. They lived virtually in the open air, in the forest, in green tents, resorting to camouflage tactics that would conceal their presence from air observers. They dug underground factories and laboratories that they might better be shielded from the electrical detectors of the Hans. They tapped the radio communication lines of the Hans with crude instruments at first, better ones later on. They bent every effort toward the redevelopment of science. For many generations, they labored as unseen, unknown scholars of the Hans, picking up their knowledge piecemeal as fast as they were able to. During the earlier part of this period, there were many deadly wars fought between the various gangs and occasional, courageous but childishly futile attacks upon the Hans, followed by terribly punitive raids. But as knowledge progressed, the sense of American brotherhood redeveloped. Reciprocal arrangements were made among the gangs over constantly increasing areas. Trade developed to a certain extent, as between one gang and another, but the interchange of knowledge became more important than that of goods, as skill in the handling of synthetic processes developed. Within the gang, an economy was developed that was a compromise between individual liberty and a military socialism. The right of private property was limited practically to personal possessions, but private privileges were many and sacredly regarded. Stimulation to achievement lay chiefly in the winning of various kinds of leadership and prerogatives, and only in a very limited degree in the hope of owning anything that might be classified as wealth and nothing that might be classified as resources. Resources of every description for military safety and efficiency belonged as a matter of public interest to the community as a whole. In the meantime, through these many generations, the Hans had developed a luxury economy, and with it, the perfection of gilded vice and degradation. The Americans were regarded as wild men of the woods. And since they neither needed nor wanted the woods or the wild men, they treated them as beasts and were conscious of no human brotherhood with them. As time went on, and synthetic processes of producing foods and materials were further developed, less and less ground was needed by the Hans for the purposes of agriculture, and finally, even the working of mines was abandoned when it became cheaper to build up metal from electronic vibrations than to dig them out of the ground. The Han race, devitalized by its vices and luxuries, with machinery and scientific processes to satisfy its every want, with virtually no necessity of labor, began to assume a defensive attitude toward the Americans. And quite naturally, the Americans regarded the Hans with a deep, grim hatred, conscious of individual superiority as men, knowing that laterally they were outstripping the Hans in science and civilization. They longed desperately for the day when they could be powerful enough to rise and annihilate the yellow blight that lay over the continent. At the time of my awakening, the gangs were rather loosely organized, but were considering the establishment of a special military force, whose special business it would be to harry the Hans and bring down their airships whenever possible, without causing general alarm among the Mongolians. This force was destined to become the nucleus of the national force when the day of retribution arrived, but that, however, did not happen for 10 years and is another story. Wilma told me she was a member of the Wyoming Gang, which claimed this entire Wyoming Valley as its territory, under the leadership of Boss Hart. Her mother and father were dead, and she was unmarried, so she was not a family member. She lived in a little group of tents known as Camp 17 under a woman camp boss with 7 other girls.